Dogworks Radio is sponsored by Alaska Dogworks. Check out their website at alaskadogworks.com. From Dogworks Radio, this is Mushing Radio. We hope you enjoyed this episode, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Alex Stein and Robert Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto, created for Dogworks Radio.
Hello and welcome, everybody. This is Robert Forto, and you're listening to Mushing Radio here on KVRF 89.7 in the Mat-Su Valley. RadioFreePalmer.org is our live streaming site. You can find all of our episodes over on dogworksradio.com. Be sure to check us out on social media at Dogworks Radio. And today I'm joined by my co-host, Alex Stein. He's calling in from, I assume, sunny California. How's it going, Alex?
It's going well. You know, I feel a little guilty because it's right before Christmas and it's about 70 degrees here. And I know a lot of people are digging out from various snowstorms and looking forward to more snowstorms. And obviously that's great for the mushing world.
It is great for the mushing world. It's currently snowing right here. We've gotten about 3 or 4 inches in the last day or so up here in Willow, and we have some exciting news to talk about. We are 76 days and 23 hours out from Iditarod as we record this on Saturday, the 19th of December. And let's jump right into this, Alex. Just yesterday, Iditarod dropped some very interesting information, their race plan for the 2021 race. Let's talk about the race first, and then we'll talk about the COVID protocols and all that. What do you know about the race moving forward?
So this year, they are going to do a very, very different race. And basically, they're going to do what they're referring to as, I believe, the Gold Loop Trail. So it's going to start in Willow, go over the Alaska Range, go to the town of Iditarod, and then a little bit past that to an abandoned mining area called Flat. And then basically, and it hasn't been decided exactly how this will work, to turn around and go back across the Alaska Range again. And I believe at the moment they are talking about having the finish of the race be in or near Willow, where the restart is.
Yeah, it's going to be an exciting race, and I'm interested to dive into this with you. And we do have to put a caveat before we move forward. On our last episode, we talked about our predictions of what was going to happen in Iditarod 21. It was the day before they announced their COVID plan that they released it on a press statement, Iditarod.com. And we got a heck of a lot of flack from that, didn't we?
We did, and I'm not exactly sure why, because I don't think that what we said was anything that was too controversial, and I think that a lot of the details in the Iditarod COVID plan were actually addressing things that we had been talking about.
Yeah, I mean, we were even called quote-unquote experts, and for folks that are long-time listeners of the show, we've been doing this for well over a decade. We talk about mushing all the time, and I think we have a little bit of a little finger on the pulse of this, don't we?
Yeah, and you know, one of the things that we always talk about, and that I make a point of talking about, is I'm not a musher. I'm a very informed fan at this point. You are a musher. You're in touch with a lot of people in the mushing community. And so I think that combination is a really good way to approach the sport. And, we're cognizant of the fact that the ITC and the race marshal and everyone involved with the race is serving a number of different constituencies at the same time. There's the musher community, there's the fan community, there's the sponsors, there's the volunteers, and, you know, at some point, the ITC and the race marshal and a bunch of other people have to make decisions. And it has always been my belief that these people know a lot more than we do, a lot more than most fans and most mushers do, and that they are acting in good faith, and they are trying to put on the race in the way that is the best for all of these various constituencies. And no matter what they decide, it's going to make some people annoyed. It's going to make some people angry. And, you know, you throw the whole pandemic into this, it becomes a lot more complicated. And I think, and a lot of people have said similar things, and Danny Seavey in particular has said that he believes that this current plan for how the race is going to proceed is something that can be very successful. So, you know, there are still some things we don't know, and there are still some things I don't think are going to be decided until much closer to the race, and some things that'll be, you know, adjusted while the race is going on. But it's a very interesting turn of events, and I think it's one that, although it's going to make a lot of different people unhappy in different ways, is going to be really good for the race, and I think is going to make it possible to do this race in a way that is relatively safe and can be successfil.
So, Alex, let's jump right into this race and talk about it for a bit. You had mentioned that it's called the Iditarod Gold Trail Loop, and it is quite a bit different than your typical Iditarod. It is running the southern route of Iditarod. I'm not sure, was it supposed to run the southern route this year, Alex?
I believe so, yeah.
Okay, so at this point, when we're recording, it's supposed to start, the ceremonial start in downtown Anchorage, and that may look a lot different than it has in the past with the pandemic and all that. We talked about it on our previous show about the banquet and will that happen and so forth. And then they're going to go up to Willow and do the traditional restart. And we again talked about that before, about how the community center up here is closed and COVID protocols and all that. We're going to talk about that in just a second. Then it's going to follow the normal route as we go down the trail. It's going to go to Yetna, it's going to go to Squintna, Finger Lake, Rainy Pass, Roan, Nikolai, McGrath, and then onward to Iditarod. And then, as you mentioned, a little bit ways down the trail, they're going to have a turnaround and then go back pretty much the same way that they came. They may do some adjustments there, but there's some interesting parts to this. Is they're going to go over the Alaska Range twice, and that's notoriously one of the toughest sections of the trail, and they're doing it twice, and they've never run it the opposite way, have they?
Right. They never have. Some people have taken that trail the opposite way, but the race itself has never gone that way.
So we're going to see the Dalzell Gorge twice. We're going to see the steps down and up, in reverse, which should be very interesting. My first question when I read about this was, do you think that there's going to be a lot of head-on traffic as they move closer towards the gorge? I don't think there will be a lot of that because that turnaround point is so much further down the trail than where the gorge is. Do you agree or disagree?
I basically do agree. I think there might be some, there might be a little bit more traffic, maybe a little bit farther than the gorge when people are turning around and when the back of the packers might still be there. But one of the things that to keep in mind is that traditionally the Iditarod is more or less 1,000 miles. And this route, they're saying, is going to be approximately 860 miles. So it is a little bit shorter. And I think that that's going to mean that, we're going to see a race that could be a day or two faster than what we traditionally see. But On the other hand, going over the Alaska Range twice is going to slow things down, I think, at least a little bit.
Yeah, and we've talked many times on our Iditarod coverage about strategy of the race, especially on this first third. We've seen people like Martin Bucer go all the way, 300 miles down the trail before stopping, and other folks going all the way to Finger Lake. And, there's many strategies that are built into this. So it could be a relatively quick race to the turnaround, depending on how people strategize, especially for those front of the pack guys. Don't you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And the other thing is we've seen a lot that people will have dogs that are more powerful but not necessarily faster, who they want to have on the team to get them over the Alaska Range. And then a lot of teams will drop those type of dogs after they're through the Alaska Range so that they can go a little bit more fast. And teams like Dallas Seavey, who will be back in the race this year, has sort of made a career in Iditarod out of getting really, really fast, smaller dogs who just tear up the coast in the last third of the race. But that's not going to be a strategy that necessarily will work for him or other people, because you're going to want to have those really powerful and maybe slightly slower dogs for when you have to recross the Alaska Range, which will be closer to the end of the race now.
Right. And I don't think that they've announced any mandatory rests or anything like that, whether they're having a 24-hour rest or 8-hour rest, things that they typically do on the trail. They did say that they're going to do a formal press release towards the end of January, which is going to be interesting for volunteers and folks that are traveling up. And I want to talk a little bit about Willow itself. Being a resident here in Willow, we are part of all sorts of community pages and all that. But before we do, let's talk about the COVID plan. And this is what they announced right after our last show. And they have done a heck of a job with this, moving forward. And I just want to talk about the sort of the key points of it, and then maybe we can do a little bit of discussion. The core tenets of the plan are proactive, strategic, and anticipatory plan. They're going to have a negative bubble with minimal interaction with the community. And as we mentioned, the last great race will be different. The key strategies are to minimize to essential personnel without compromising safety. Again, that negative bubble, consistent surveillance through testing and daily health screening, 2 negative tests before travel to the Anchorage area for the race, multiple tests in Anchorage to confirm negative status, mandatory masking, which will reduce the spread of COVID. All test results, contact tracing, etc. will be maintained by the COVID team personnel. There's going to be inclusive communication with all stakeholders. They're going to manage expectations, and this is an important part of it, to participants, villages, sponsors, mushers, Iditariders, etc. Iditarod.com will be the dashboard to keep track of all the cases and tests, and there will be a zero tolerance for not following protocols, mandatory masking, required testing, daily screening, social distancing, hand washing, eat and sleep in the bubble, meaning there is going to be no in and out whatsoever, and distance and approved interaction within the communities. So what stands out to you right there? That sounds very similar to what we're dealing with in other sports. We talk about the National Football League and hockey and all of that and their policies. It sounds similar to that, doesn't it?
It does. There's a couple of things that I wanted to mention. The people, and I'm talking volunteers and mushers, will have to have testing before they arrive in Anchorage, and then there will be additional testing during the race and when people are around the race. a lot of that testing, especially for the volunteers, is going to be on the volunteers' own dime. So people are going to have to be paying out of pocket for a lot of additional testing. And while for many people that will not be a big deal, I think for some people that additional financial issue might be something that would make them less likely to come, less likely to volunteer. So that's the first thing I wanted to mention. The other thing is that this idea of having these bubbles, both before the race and at the checkpoint, is a great idea. And I think we still haven't seen all of the details with how that will be enforced and how that will be put into play. One of the things that's always been, frankly, amazing to me about Iditarod is that it is so open and that people can literally go on the trail and interact with mushers and interact with teams. You know, people can go to some of the early or even some of the later checkpoints and just be there. I don't know how the Iditarod is going to enforce preventing that from happening because, for example, one of the things that I have liked best about the ceremonial start is that once you get into the woods in Anchorage, people have cookouts and mushers will a lot of the time stop and interact with the fans, and fans will give them hot dogs and, other things. I don't know how you prevent that from happening in what's basically a public area that you can't police. And that's just in Anchorage. So I don't know what's going to happen when you're actually out on the trail. And while it's great for them to be controlling the health and testing all of these volunteers, if you have a significant number of people who are considered outside the bubble who are able to interact with the mushers, then that is a big potential problem. And I'm not saying that it's a problem that can't be solved, but I think that's one of the areas that we haven't seen really addressed yet.
Yes, and there's a lot to unpack there. But one thing that I would like to mention, and for folks that have not traveled up to Alaska since the pandemic has started, we have a pretty rigorous testing protocol in place at the airport. If you are a resident of the state, everybody has to stop and be tested as they enter into Alaska, and they corral you right in. There is no ifs, ands, or buts about it. You're doing it whether you want to do it or not. And you go through this process, then you go downstairs, you take the test, and then, of course, a couple of days later, they send you an email saying if you're positive or negative, and you're supposed to quarantine during that time. And I believe I've flown in and out of Alaska 5 times since March, and it's been the same process every time. Now, where it's interesting is if you're a non-resident, and you had mentioned that when you were speaking, if you're flying to Alaska, right now you have to have either a negative test or pending results within 72 hours of flying to Alaska. So that's 3 days. So if you're flying to Alaska on Tuesday, you have to have been tested today, which is obviously Saturday, and those tests have to be negative. If you do not have a test, you have to pay for that test at the airport. And it's a $250 test. And that's not light on the pocketbook for anybody if they have to do that. And then you had mentioned the testing is going to be on the volunteers and the other folks that are coming forward and whether they have to pay. I don't know how they're going to do that. I don't know what the charge would be, but that can be significant for people that have to do it, several times. And they're saying potentially every day. So I think that could really add up. And what's interesting, Alex, is after this plan came out and after our podcast episode was released, I started talking to a friend of mine who is going to be running the Iditarod this year on her rookie year. And this was before the new race was announced or anything like that. But she said one of her biggest concerns was if she is found to be negative when she starts, but then she gets halfway into the race and then she tests positive, and then they pull her off of the race, and of course she has to withdraw. And then she said, what if it's a false positive? You can't stand around and wait at the Finger Lake checkpoint, for example, for 2 days or whatever it takes to do those tests. What do you think about that, about the potential of being pulled off the trail if it's a positive test, and what happens if they have to wait for a period of time? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously a risk. I think some of the newer tests have much fewer false positives and false negatives, but I believe there is a part of the new COVID protocol dealing with confirming positive tests. But as you said, the team will have to basically shelter at the in quarantine at a checkpoint or at part of a checkpoint while they wait for the additional tests to come through. And I don't know what kind of tests they're going to be using, and whether there's whether there are tests where you can get the results much quicker, where you can get results in an hour or two as opposed to 12 or 24 hours.
Yeah, that could really shake up how the race is run, I think. And again, we're just kind of speculating about how that will go into place. But I'm sure a lot of people are thinking of that, and a lot of people, just in our daily lives are worried about those false positives. And if they take a test today at the local Walgreens or whatever, and they find out that they're positive, they have to decide, oh my goodness, do I have to quarantine my family? Does everybody have to be tested? Am I going to lose my job, et cetera, because of a potential false positive test, or in fact a positive test moving forward? So it could be a very interesting and potentially a scary situation as they move down the trail. But as we're reading through this COVID protocol, it looks like they did everything that they should have done. I mean, it's a very well thought out plan. Do you have any thoughts about the plan itself? Do you think they missed anything? I know that you've really been keeping up on this whole pandemic and COVID and all that. You're very active about it on Twitter. What do you think about the plan as it's laid out right now?
I think it's a really good plan, and possibly even the best possible plan that they could come up with right now. So I'm cautiously optimistic about this. I do think that the one potential source of problems or potential infections is the public. In other words, people who are spectators who are there before or during the ceremonial start in Anchorage, people who are in contact with volunteers or with handlers or anyone like that. I'm worried that there are people who are going to somehow fall outside the bubble, who will have contact with people in the bubble, especially before the start. So that's kind of my chief concern. As we've said, we don't know what the details of the ceremonial start are going to be, and what sort of crowd control or ways of keeping crowds away are going to be used. But that's always been, I think, the thing that potentially could trip a lot of this up.
So before we talk about the start and restart in Willow, I have an interesting question to pose, and that is the finisher's belt buckle and the official, Iditarod finishers, that whole thing that goes with it. With it, a lot of people, when they sign up for Iditarod, it's a once in a lifetime thing, and it's a bucket list thing, and they're running it, and their whole intention is to travel by dog team to get to Nome, and then they want to finish the race and get that belt buckle and all of that. Now, of course, everything in our lives has changed because of the pandemic, but what are your thoughts on that? Do you think it's going to be the same for these guys, these rookies in particular? And what about the belt buckle? And what about the, getting to Nome and, the Red Lantern and the Burled Arch and all that, pomp and circumstance that comes with finishing Iditarod? What are your thoughts as a fan in particular?
If I have to say, if I were a rookie, I would be a little bit let down that I wouldn't be able to finish in Nome, because that's always such a big part of the whole experience of Iditarod. I think there are some people who will say this is not as much of an achievement because it's an 860-mile race instead of a 1,000-mile race. I think it's just going to be a different kind of achievement. And, it's interesting to me that the Iditarod for a while has been discouraging people from coming up to Alaska, especially people from outside, coming to Alaska for the start, has urged people to wait until 2022 for the 50th running of the race. I think that it is obviously still an enormous achievement, even if it's only an 860-mile achievement instead of 1,000 miles. People will be crossing the Alaska Range twice, which is a big deal. What I sort of was wondering when they announced this new plan is, and I don't know because I haven't been in contact with a lot of people about this, is how the rookies are actually going to feel, because in a sense they signed up for a different kind of race when they signed up for this race, and it's still Iditarod, it's still under the auspices of the ITC and all of that, but it really does seem like it's a different and unique animal that we're going to see in 2021 than any other year.
Yeah, I find it really interesting, and I would love to find out what they're thinking. And since they just released this yesterday, I haven't had a chance to talk to any of my rookie friends that are going to be running it. And I say that to you, Alex, because you've heard people over the years say, hey, I want to run the northern route and the southern route. One of them is harder than the other, and back and forth. And there's been talk when the race started in Fairbanks about how it's a much different race starting in Fairbanks and going that route versus, over the Alaska Range and all that. And of course, there's always differences of opinion moving forward. So I think that's going to be a really interesting concept to this as we get closer and closer. And as I said, we're less than 3 months out. Our last segment today, Alex, is about the start and restart up here in my hometown of Willow. And we talked about on our previous episode that, pretty much everything is closed down here in terms of where the Iditarod typically holds their restart. The community center is being remodeled. They have very strict protocols in place about who can come and go down on the lake this year. That was announced beforehand. And, that is going to look a lot different at the start. They're not going to bust people up. The parking lots aren't going to be plowed. All of these sort of things that are typically done are not going to happen. But what's interesting, Alex, is the finish is supposed to end in Willow on Willow Lake. And there's been much discussion on the community pages about how that's going to look. Are fans going to be allowed to be there? But more importantly, what's going to happen to the mushers? And I say this because there is a big deal of what happens after those first mushers come in Nome, and then that whole week lead up to the finishers banquet. Many of them stay around and they go out to the finish line and congratulate their fellow finishers and all that. And I think a big deal is the finishers banquet. Will they have one? And up here in Willow, there really isn't a place to do that. We have a very small trading post called the Willow Trading Post, which can hold maybe 50 people. The Sheep Creek Lodge, which is about 25 miles to the north, is just a little bit bigger than the trading post. But otherwise, in terms of a banquet, since we do not have the community center, there's not any place close by. And Wasilla is 25 miles to the south, and then of course Anchorage is an hour and a half. I think that a lot of these guys will finish the race, bed their dogs down if there's a required amount of time that they have to do that. You know, there's post vet checks and all that. And then they'll pack up the truck and go home. There won't be a lot of that pomp and circumstance that's happening even amongst the mushers, because everybody's on the road system. They can pack up their dog trucks and move on. And from a musher's perspective, I've finished many races. I have not finished Iditarod, but I've finished many races where I'll finish, I'll have the vet checks, I'll put my dogs in the truck, and I'll head out, and I'll be home in a couple of hours after the race. I see that happening a little bit with these guys. What do you think?
Yeah, absolutely. And, you know, the banquet in Nome was canceled this past year, and it does seem like that's going to be the way it's going to go, which I have to say makes sense. It does seem like it's going to be a little bit more towards, an old-fashioned view of how the Iditarod used to be. And one of the things that longtime Iditarod fans and fans of the history of dog mushing are familiar with is that when Joe Reddington Sr. first envisioned the Iditarod race, one of the plans before it was decided that it would go all the way to Nome was to go out to Iditarod and then turn around and come back. So in a way, this race is going to be closer to that conception of Iditarod. And, you know, in the early days, there was a lot of people would finish and then would pack up and would go home. So, in a way, this is going to be sort of a retro throwback kind of race.
I'm looking forward to it. I think it's going to be a fun event, regardless of how it finalizes out, how they eventually come to a conclusion about what they're going to do. Of course, there's still going to be that strategy. There's still going to be the stories. There's still going to be, the front runners and the back of the packers and all the things that lead up to Iditarod, all of those very cool moments and interviews and all of that. It's going to be a very interesting race. So before we go, Alex, what do you think of this as a whole? Do you think that this is a very good compromise? Do you think that they're grasping at straws just so they can have an event? Do you think that they should cancel? Do you think it should be different than it, as a fan, do you think it should be different than it's laid out right now? What are your thoughts?
So assuming that things get better in the next few months in terms of COVID, I think this is a really, really good plan. I think if things get significantly worse over the next few months and we don't have a turnaround, then it might be time to look at canceling the race. But I think that this is, at the moment, looking forward, this seems like it's a very good plan. There, as I mentioned, there's still a bunch of things that need to be decided. How fans are able to interact, how the press is able to be on the trail and covering this is something that has largely been sort of punted at the moment. I'm sure there will be detailed plans about it, but we don't know what those are yet. But at the moment, I would have to say this seems like a very good plan to me.
I agree with you. I think that they've done their homework, at least on how to follow protocols and all that, at least in terms of what we're dealing with up in Alaska. And I say that because a lot of our listeners are not Alaskans and they don't have that that ideal of what's happening up here, in particular about coming and going from the airport. Out of all the airports that I've flown in and out of since the pandemic has occurred, this has been the only one that requires those tests coming back. And I think that that's a really interesting thing that we have to do up here compared to other places. So I'm looking to see how this sort of lines out. Alex, anything else before we go?
One thing that we haven't talked about that I will be very interested to watch is currently we have 57 teams signed up to run the race. It will be very interesting to me to see how many of those teams decide that they are going to go forward with the race, and how many of them decide that for whatever reasons, the travel requirements or the COVID requirements or whatever, that they are going to not run the race next year and instead wait until 2022. So I'm very curious. I'm pretty sure there will be a couple that will opt not to run, but I think if there are if suddenly a lot of teams start dropping out, then that might be cause for concern.
Yeah, Thomas Werner, the reigning Iditarod champion, had to pull out just in the last month or so because of travel restrictions, and I think that that's going to be interesting. I wonder if they had any special clause in the entries, whether they could get their money back or whatever. And of course, they do that way back in June when they have entries open up, and I wonder if they had something in their sign-up procedures, whether you could withdraw or whatever based on the current situation. We might have to look into that.
Another thing that I just wanted to mention real quickly is there are still very severe and restrictive travel restrictions between the U.S. and Canada. And for a lot of teams who are coming from the lower 48, they will drive up through Canada to Alaska, usually in late December or early January, if they're not already in Alaska. And if that is difficult or impossible for teams to do, and I think the current restrictions have been extended through, I think, the end of January or the middle of January. So if that is too difficult and teams aren't able to come up to Alaska, that could be a serious thing as well.
Yeah, and that's one of the main reasons why the Yukon Quest did what they did, and they broke their race down into a different format than they had previously. So it's going to be interesting to see how it plays out, and we'll definitely come back on and update our fans and friends here as things to develop. As always, you can follow us on social media. Alex, where's the best place for people to find you?
Usually people can find me on Twitter. I am at Coldfoot Films.
And I am at Robert Forto or at Dogworks Radio. You can find all of our commentary and questions and DMs and all of that on Facebook, Twitter, or whatever there as well. Alex, it's been a pleasure. We'll talk again soon, okay?
Okay, thanks, Robert.
Thank you. On behalf of my co-host, Alex Stein, this is Robert Forto. We will see you guys next time. Goodbye.
From First Paw Media, this is Dogworks Radio. We hope you enjoyed this podcast, and we invite you to subscribe in Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. You'll find a link on the episode notes. You can tap or swipe on the episode cover art, and you'll see some offers from our sponsors. You can support our show by supporting them. If you like what you have heard, we would love it if you could give us a 5-star rating and tell your friends how to subscribe too. Your hosts are Robert and Michelle Forto. Our producer is Robert Forto and created for First Paw Media. Did you know that Alaska Dog Works trains service dogs for those in need throughout North America? Each and every service dog that is trained through the Lead Dog Service Dog Program and Michelle Forto and her team has an individual training plan. We train for autistic, mobility, psychiatric, and PTSD for our soldiers for service work. If you know of someone that may need a service dog, please take a moment and check out Alaska Dog Works on social media and at alaskadogworks.com.